Apologies, I think that people have not been able to hear me before.
Yeah.
Apologies for that, there was a technical hiccup. I'll go back a few slides and go over it relatively quick to make sure that we still capture the most important things. Apologies for that. So first, a few housekeeping notes. The webinar will be 1 hour. We are recording it and we'll send you the recording. Please put your questions in the question box and we'll pick them up throughout 2 moments in the session. And we'll share all the questions and answers with you after the webinar. Then let me introduce myself. My name is Lisanne de Weert. I'm a senior consultant at Blonk Sustainability, and I have been guiding the land use change tool development. And I haven't been alone working on this tool. My colleague Iana has worked with me on the methodology. There have been colleagues on the sales and business development side, but also colleagues at the software development side. So wanted to give a shout out to the whole team here. Then let's get into the content of the webinar. So what we'll be discussing today. So first, understanding land use change. What is the definition that we're talking about? And what are the main principles that we encounter or that we've identified to stop this phenomenon? And how does land use change accounting contribute to that? So what is the purpose and relevance of it? What are the methodological considerations around it? And how do certain standards guide you into these methodological decisions? Then we'll have some time for questions and answers, and then we'll get into the land use change impact tool itself. So the functionalities and use of it, but also the outlook and ambitions that we have with this tool and that you can expect in the near future and longer future. And then we'll give a demonstration. After that, there's again room for questions and answers. So that brings us to the point where we encountered our technical hiccup, the definition of land use change. And as you can see, the definition that we put down here is quite broad. So it encompasses the change of natural and anthropogenic land cover and activities over time. And I mentioned that deforestation is one of the most well-known and most impactful land use changes that is occurring, but there are many other ecosystems like mangroves or savannas that are also being converted, and that should also be considered when we're talking about land use change. This is an example, just a screenshot from the Global Forest Watch website that gives a really nice visualization of where global forest tree cover is being lost over time in different regions in the world. And as you can see in these pink areas, there has been tree cover loss over the last 20 years. And as we are, in most methods, we are accounting for land use change over the last 20 years. So these would be, yeah, that's why we selected this time frame. But as you can see, it impacts every continent in the world, and it's still going on in alarming rates. So besides deforestation, which is shown here in this image, there are many other ecosystems at high pressure of land use change. And when we are talking about land use change, the overall environmental impacts that it has are multiple. So the first one, and a very well-known one, is the loss of carbon stock, which is causing greenhouse gas emissions, so mainly CO2, but also other greenhouse gas emissions that affect climate change. But related to the soil carbon stock loss, there are also nutrients in the soil that are mineralizing, which also have an effect on climate change because it releases nitrous oxide emissions, but it also has an effect on land and water quality, for example, through leaching of nitrogen into the water. Then there's the destruction and disruption of habitats, which directly affects biodiversity. There's the disturbance of the microclimate. So a forest creates a certain microclimate locally, and by altering this, there's also non-carbon warming effects. So effects that do influence our global climate or local climate, and in that way could also affect a broader region, but not directly through greenhouse gases, but through other effects. And through also this disturbance, it can set into motion a snowball effect into desertification. Next to that, due to the loss of vegetation, there's increased runoff, which is causing a lot of loss of the topsoil, so soil erosion. And these are just a couple of the effects that are related to land use change on the environmental side, and of course also on the social side. there are many negative effects like the disruption of indigenous communities, which is very alarming because indigenous communities only represent about 5% of the global population, while they defend about and protect about 80% of natural ecosystems and biodiversity. And actually all these environmental issues that are related to land use change are also interconnected, so they can amplify each other in that way. So this leads us to the next question, or well, first maybe to highlight what is the focus area of this webinar, and that's mainly about the effects on climate change. So when we're talking about land use change emissions, then we're actually scoping only around these effects on climate change, so both from CO2 but also from other greenhouse gases. And then this brings us to the question, how do we halt this? How do we stop this? Both the land conversion, so the land use change, but also the emissions that occur from it. Well, first we have to stop deforestation, which is going on. Deforestation, but also conversions of other ecosystems. So platforms like Global Forest Watch give a very good tool for this, to really incentivize action on a really local scale. Secondly, we have to reduce our land occupation. With our growing population, we have an increasing demand for agricultural land, and this is driving land use change. So the only way to really solve this issue and to really reduce this expansion of land is to reduce land occupation while still maintaining yields and food security. And as a third point, we identified to limit carbon losses from land use change. We can talk about carbon losses in the context of emissions, but we can talk about biodiversity losses in a broader context. So how can we create food systems where there is more room for biodiversity, where there's more carbon stored in soils and in vegetation, and how can we make sure that those systems are placed on locations that make sure that the least amount of natural carbon or natural vegetation is lost. So wisely selecting the land that you use for agriculture and the land that you could give back to nature to regenerate. This brings us to land use change accounting. So the purpose of accounting for land use change emissions within your life cycle assessment or LCA, or within your greenhouse gas assessment, is to attribute these conversions, these land use changes, to specific commodities, and then determine the emissions from these conversions. And by doing this, we relate also not just these emissions, but also the responsibility for land use change to commodities and their purchasers. And because we are able to report them in a very well-known metric, so kilogram CO2 equivalent, we can compare these land use change emissions within our inventory to other emission sources like land management emissions. And in this way, it becomes part of our inventory and also of mitigation strategies. So focusing on land use change reduction becomes a big lever to reach your mitigation ambitions. So of course, this translates to the relevance of it to incentivize action throughout the whole supply chain to halt land use change and land use change emissions. So what are the emissions exactly that we're talking about? So consider a certain land use change or a land conversion from a natural vegetation, so in this example it's a forest, to an anthropogenic land use, so in this case a cropland. In this natural situation we have a certain above ground biomass, a below ground biomass, so the root systems, and then surface litter and that organic matter that is related to the carbon cycling of these systems. And there's a lot of carbon in the soil. And this soil carbon is directly related to certain nutrients that also live in the soil, like nitrogen. So if we change to a lower carbon system, we see lower above ground biomass and below ground biomass, and also lower or less dead organic matter. But also because of the disruption of the soil, a lot of carbon in the soil will oxidize, and due to a fixed carbon to nitrogen ratio in the soil, also some of these soil nutrients will mineralize, causing these nitrous oxide emissions. So these are basically the emissions that we are considering when we're talking about land use change. Then still there are a lot of different methods available to attribute certain conversions, so the hectares of conversion, to certain commodities. And I wanted to highlight just a couple of them, first in a broader overview and then going into depth for into each one of those. So first, direct land use change or statistical land use change. They're slightly different concepts, but they follow the same principle. And within that, there is some choice still in the methodology that you apply. So here there's a choice, for example, between equal amortization and linear amortization. If you're not sure what that means, that's okay. We'll come back to that in a different slide later. So basically, the principle is that we look at a reference with, so for a certain commodity or a certain crop, you always consider your current situation compared to a reference state. And that reference state in this case is land use X years ago. And often that time frame is set to 20 years. So we're looking at historic land use change over that period. And the scope therefore only is the land under study. So that's why it's called direct land use change. And that's also what statistical land use change is about. In principle, looking at the land that is used to grow a certain commodity. And therefore you hope to have a somewhat direct relation to recent deforestation or other land conversions. Carbon opportunity cost uses a different principle. So instead of a historic reference that is a certain number of years ago, we're looking at natural land use. And this can be either pre-anthropogenic land use, so pristine land use, or it can be the natural land use that is growing back after abandonment of the land. But it's not necessarily related to a certain moment in time. So it's basically canceling out this this time frame aspect in your reference system. The scope is still to look at the land under study. So with this, I mean the land used to grow a specific commodity or a specific crop that you're studying. And in this way, it's sort of decoupled of the timing of deforestation or land conversions that took place. Then a third one that I wanted to highlight is indirect land use change, because of also a different fundamental aspect to it. The reference is still X years ago, so we're still looking at historic land use changes, but the scope is not just the land directly used to grow a certain commodity or crop, but it's all the land that is impacted by a change in demand for a certain commodity or crop. So to take this into account, you need certain biophysical or econometric models to take into account how these systems correlate to each other and how a shift in demand for one commodity can change a growing or shrinking land area for other commodities as well. So often these indirect land use change models are associated with much more complex and therefore also in a way more uncertain models. So to get into those into a little bit, so to get into a little bit more detail about those three methods. So direct or statistical land use change looks at recent land use change related to the land use for cultivation of a specific crop from a specific country, for example. But country can be interchanged by any other spatial explicitness. So it can also be on a plot level, but it can also be on a continent level. And basically, if you would follow the approach based on product expansion, then you would follow a couple of steps, which is first to identify the expansion rate of a certain crop, then identify for the expanded land what were the conversions that took place to free up this land. So what other types of land use declined in area within that region that you're studying, so which are most likely to have been cleared up to free this land. And then based on those conversions, you can calculate the carbon stock difference, both in the soil and in the vegetation. And as a fourth step, you amortize these emissions over the amortization timeframe. And mostly this is chosen to be 20 years. And then still there are multiple ways to do this. So we can get to that later as well. So the aim here is to identify, well, in the case of statistic land use change, crop country combinations which were driving land use change, for example, deforestation. So the characteristics of this method is that it's quite evaluative. It's based on this historic land use change, and there's no global system or dependencies in the global system taken into account. In the statistical land use change methodology that we implemented, we're using country-level statistics from the FAO. You could also use geospatial data for this. So especially if you're looking at direct land use change, then you're going to calculate the conversions specifically for your plot. And then you can use satellite data or other geospatial information to look back into your responsibility window. So look back those 20 years to see which conversions took place, and then calculate the carbon stock differences based on that. If we go to this carbon opportunity cost, then the principle is a bit different. So the underlying principle is that food production always incurs a carbon opportunity cost, which is the potential for natural CO2 removal via ecosystem restoration on that land. So basically this metric reflects how much carbon can be sequestered annually if we would allow for renaturation of these areas, which are now used to grow certain commodities. There's different publications around this metric and similar metrics. So I got to know this metric through a publication of Tim Searchinger, but there's similar concepts like land carbon losses, which are related to similar concepts. So which also doesn't look at land use change related to the last 20 years of a certain land, but more, rather looks at the potential of land use. So the potential carbon that can be stored on that land. So to calculate this, you would first calculate the carbon stock difference between your current occupation. So that's, for example, an annual cropland or a perennial cropland system, or maybe a grassland system for grazing, and compare that to the natural vegetation. And to define this natural vegetation, again, there's multiple ways to do it. In one of these papers from Searchinger, it was determined via a natural regrowth model. So simulating under the current climate how natural vegetation would regrow after human abandonment, and then taking that as a reference for as the natural vegetation. So because we are looking at a missed potential per year of occupation, we would amortize this over a certain amount of years to approximate how it would grow, how this natural vegetation would grow back. The aim of using this type of metric is to reduce the pressure on deforestation or any other land conversions by optimal land use. So in the end, by incorporating this kind of metric in your life cycle assessment, you would see a trade-off between the natural amount of carbon that is not that you're missing, that is not sequestered because you're occupying it, and the land management emissions that you're inducing compared to the yield that you get from the land. So in that way, you can solve the puzzle by seeing, by basically, favoring land occupation at places where natural vegetation would be the least rich, would have the lowest carbon stock, but where crops would have the highest yields. So therefore, it also decouples from this historic aspect, because that really favors the land use in areas where deforestation already took place hundreds of years ago, like in Europe, for example. Indirect land use change is a metric that is not incorporated in our tool. I already want to give that as a disclaimer, but it's an interesting metric nonetheless because it covers such a different kind of concept. So the principle is that the demand for a specific product causes a shift in production of other products in other areas. And so you're taking into account this global system and the interdependencies in it to calculate where land use change might occur due to the purchasing or the production of an extra kilo of a certain commodity or crop. So it's defined as recent land use change elsewhere resulting from changes in demand to a specific crop from a specific country. And again, this can be on a different spatial level as well. So models which are used are, for example, biophysical models or econometric models, and eventually it's also expressed in CO2 equivalent. And in the type of life cycle assessment work that we do in the food and agricultural sector, it's not that common to use indirect land use change, but especially in the discussions around biofuel, this metric is used more. So we have a small example here on the right, which also is sort of related to it. So for example, if you would start using sugar beet pulp for animal feed, but it would also hold if you would use it for fuel, for example, you would first have a direct land use change, a conversion from cropland used for food to cropland used for feed or used for fuel. But that induces in the end more land demand, because in the end, as humans also need our food. So there will probably be indirect land use change, for example, from forest to new croplands, which can still meet this demand for food for humans. Then stepping a bit away from these specific methodologies and looking back at these 3 mitigation strategies that we identified before. So how can we link these two together? So the first one that we talked about is immediate stop of deforestation and land use change that is ongoing. So for that, engagement with suppliers is important. So it's not just about shifting away from regions where deforestation is occurring, but it's also about engaging with those suppliers and make sure that they stop any ongoing land conversions as soon as possible or directly, and show that there is a real incentive throughout the whole supply chain for that. So those are the two main points. On the one hand, engagement with the suppliers, but on the other hand, if you don't have the ability to engage with suppliers, then at least sourcing from regions with lower risk of land use change and deforestation can be a way to do that. So both based on, well, this can be either based on more generic statistical land use change data, but rather on a more spatially explicit level, so a subnational level, or rather via traceable certifications. And how land use change accounting can help in that. So as I already mentioned, these statistical land use change values can help on different spatial scales. But also if there is engagement possible, so if you can engage throughout your supply chain to discover where exactly the land is occupied, then you can obtain this geospatial data. So for example, satellite data of these specific plots and calculate direct land use change emissions from this. So for example, in the tool that we'll show later on, you can play around with when the conversion took place and what was the previous land use to see how that influences your emissions. Secondly, we have to reduce our land occupation overall. So the actions related to that is shifting overall consumption patterns to land efficient food products. So generally, meat and other animal protein sources take up more land per calorie or protein delivered compared to plant-based sources. So where possible, this shift can be made. But of course, also within existing systems, so within the same system, if you increase the output or yield per hectare, then that would in the end also lead to a lower demand of land. So how land use change accounting can help in that is to integrate land use change emissions within your life cycle assessment. And for example, this is also done in life cycle inventory databases, like AgriFootprint, but also other databases that are out there from other providers, to identify and give insight into these trade-offs between land use change and land management emissions. Also, looking at other types of metrics, like the carbon opportunity cost, more equally penalizes any type of land occupation. So whether there was recent deforestation or other conversions or not, it will always show the cost of occupying land. And then the third point that was identified is to limit carbon losses from land use. So actions related to this is favoring products from or food systems in general with a high carbon stock. So agroforestry or food forests, or in general using perennial crops. And secondly, wisely using the available land. That is, wisely using the available land in the sense, for example, that we cultivate crops where input requirements are lowest and output is highest, but also where natural vegetation would have been less rich, so would have been poorer. So this also relates to a lower loss of carbon from your conversions. And this is to some extent reflected in the carbon opportunity cost metric. So because you're taking into account the natural situation, but also the current situation, you can see how much carbon you're losing compared to the outputs that your system provides. Then there are a lot of other methodological considerations. And also regarding time, I think we shouldn't get into those in depth. One that I wanted to point out is the amortization period and the amortization method, because it's quite, it's this debate around which amortization method to use is recently becoming more important. So with the amortization period, we mean the period over which land use change emissions are calculated and considered. And so sometimes it's also called the responsibility window. And in most standards, it is said to be 20 years. And the amortization method refers to how you amortize or allocate those emissions over time. So the next slide goes into that in a bit more detail. So if we would apply equal discounting, for example, or equal amortization, it means that all the emissions from a certain land use change event, so for example, deforestation at a certain hectare, would be equally distributed over those 20 years within your responsibility window, which means that each year would receive 5% of the emissions. And that relates to these yellow bars. So it's equal. So after 20 years after the event, you would have a sudden stop of the emissions within your accounting or life cycle assessment. And this is a method that's implemented in the POS 2050, which is a standard that we'll also discuss a bit later. Another metric or another way to do amortization is linear discounting. And this places more weight on the recent years after the land use change event and linearly decreases throughout those 20 years. So this basically means that right after deforestation events, you are accounting for a higher percentage of the emissions, and this gradually decreases until 0 after 20 years. So this first method, this equal discounting, has been implemented in the Blonk land use change tool since 2012, since the beginning, because that mainly followed the POS 2050 methodology. And this linear discounting methodology has been implemented last year, as it has always also been required by the Science Based Targets Initiative, Forest Land Use and Agriculture guidance. We'll also note those later, so if you're confused about these different standards, don't worry for now. So talking about these standards, the POS 2050 is one of the first methods, at least that I know of, that was quite widely accepted within the life cycle assessment community regarding how to account for land use change emissions. So it is, for example, still the recommended method to use within the product environmental footprint guidance. And this methodology is specified in quite a lot of detail which steps you need to take to account for statistical land use change if there is no better data available. So of course, it's always preferred to use direct land use change, so really obtaining this geospatial data of your plot and calculating the actual land conversions that took place. But if this is not available, then this option is provided to perform a statistical land use change calculation. This calculation is based on global statistics from the FAO, and it basically attributes land use change to commodities based on their expansion rate. So how much the occupation of the crop expanded over the last 20 years. And it implements this equal amortization. Then recently, and it's still ongoing actually, is the development of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Land Sector and Removals Guidance. It's quite a mouthful, it's a long name, but it basically means that if you're reporting under the Greenhouse Gas Protocol for your corporate carbon footprint, and if you have land sector activities, then you should follow the land sector and removals guidance for those land sector activities. Currently, the guidance is still in draft status, so it's not yet public, and it's also not yet sure what the exact land use change methodology will be. So there is a specific chapter dedicated to land use change and land use tracking. So there will definitely be a lot of guidance and clarity provided in this guidance. But at this moment, yeah, we can only say that we are part of the technical working group for this. We were part of the revision workshops, and we're also an aligned partner. So this latter means that we are committed to incorporating any of the methodological recommendations and decisions that they put forward in this guidance, that we are committed to incorporate those in our tool. But at this moment, we're not sure yet what those recommendations will be. One thing that is likely to be included is a land tracking metric, which is similar or the same as the carbon opportunity cost. Then the third standard that I wanted to discuss is the Science-Based Targets Initiative specific guidance for the forest, land use and agriculture sector. So again, here, if you have set your targets under SBTI, and you have a large part of your emissions that is taking place in either one of these land-based sectors, then you should follow this guidance to account for your emissions and set your goals. For those who are not that familiar with the Science-Based Targets Initiative, it is it provides basically a clearly defined pathway for companies to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions in the next 20 years in line with the latest climate science. So that means what is necessary to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement to limit our global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial times. And these emission reductions, should be your targets, basically. So as noted, for land-based emissions, this specific guidance should be followed. And what this guidance specifies around land use change is that linear amortization should be applied. So if you remember, that's the method that puts more weight onto recent years after the deforestation or land use change event took place. So that was also a main reason for us to implement this linear amortization method into our land use change tool last year. Still, for most of the emission calculations and also for the details about land use change emissions, SBTI flag refers to the greenhouse gas protocol that we have just discussed. So there's a bit of a gap there because the flag guidance is already published, whereas the greenhouse gas protocol is not yet finalized. So let's take a little bit of time for some questions now before we dive into the tool.
Yeah, and we also have a question for the audience.
Ah, yeah, we have a question for you. Yeah. Quite a big share already voted. Good to see that there's only a small share of people who don't intend to use any land use change data.
And where can I share? Yeah.
Yeah, so a lot of focus on incorporating the results in product footprints and in organizational footprints, but also to get insight into supply chain and use it for decision making.
Okay.
So it's good to know that there's also a lot of incentive to use it into supply chain management and decision making, because in the end, that's a great way forward to stop land use change. Shall we continue to the questions from the chat?
Yeah. Yeah. selected some questions. First question, what method is used in environmental product declarations?
That is a very good question. I'm not exactly sure. I am aware of these developments on European Commission level that these will at some point become mandatory for some products. But I'll check. I'm assuming because it's legislation that's coming from the European Commission that they would adopt the product environmental footprint framework, which is also developed by the European Commission. And therefore it's related to these PEF guidelines, which in turn refer to the post-2050 methodology. So that's the methodology, statistic land use change with equal amortization. So that is what I can imagine, but it's a good one to look into and share more insights into the frequently asked questions later on. Yeah.
Okay, then there's another question about linear and equal discounting. Would linear or equal discounting be used in relation to emission factors? For example, if I have an EF that is 5 tons of CO2 ton of product, I would multiply that EF by 95%, 90%, 85%, etc., until deforestation is out of the supply chain for linear discounting. Is this correct?
So in essence, indeed, if you calculated the emissions from a certain conversion, then you're only accounting for a part of that in your yearly LCA. But that is in the case that there's one land use change event at one point in time. Usually, if you would apply statistic land use change, then there are some conversions every year. And so you basically perform the calculation over and over again each year to see which conversions took place in which year and multiply that with the associated amortization percentage. But luckily, all of that is done within the methodology. And for example, if you are using emission factors from a database like AgriFootprint, then this is already done within the background of these databases. So you won't be required to do this yourself. I'm not sure if this answers the question, but we can elaborate again a bit in the document afterwards.
Then there are also some questions related to the tool, which we will answer later. Do we have time for a last question?
Yeah, maybe one question.
Do you also calculate the negative emissions of carbon sequestration if you convert degraded land to forest?
That's a good question. So then your forest would be your productive system. So that could be the case in case of a food forest or in case of forestry products, for example. And that is a methodological choice that is open in our tool. So you are allowed to choose to allow for negative land use change emissions or not. And I have to say that this is still a bit unclear in the standards whether this is allowed or not. So before we never included these negative emissions in our databases because there's too much uncertainty related to these results, and we don't want to generate credits in a way with this. But in essence, it's possible to use the tool to calculate these carbon sequestrations. And yeah, especially if you're looking at something like carbon opportunity cost, this can definitely happen. So if you're converting a degraded annual cropland, for example, to a well-functioning mixed perennial system, then you certainly have a carbon stock increase that could be reflected in something like land use change emissions. So short answer, it's a methodological question which is mainly dependent on which standard you use and how you interpret those standards. Maybe we can go on to the tool and then have some room for questions after. Yeah. So we saw this overview before with these three main land use change metrics. And before, in our previous Excel-based land use change tool that some of the listeners might know, there was one method implemented, which was direct land use change and statistical land use change, and then only the equal amortization. Now we have transferred into a web-based land use change impact tool with extended functionalities, and we included also this linear amortization within direct and statistical land use change, but also included an interpretation of the carbon opportunity cost metric. So altogether, this tool, which looks like the screenshot on the right, can help you to calculate these direct and statistical land use change emissions in a way that is according to leading land use change standards and guidelines. And yeah, when we say that, we want to also say, sort of explain the nuance that we are following past 2050, for example. That standard has been out there for more than 10 years already. But in these developing standards, like the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, we are really engaged in those discussions, and we are committed to including those changes, but we cannot guarantee that it's in line with those standards yet, mainly also because it's not finalized. Also in this web-based tool, we allow for a lot of flexibility for the user. So you can create different scenarios by adjusting a lot of the parameters used in these land use change calculations. And in that way, we want to give more insight to the user where these emissions actually come from and how certain decisions that you make in the calculation method actually influence it. So that also relates to the fourth point, also by comparing these different methodologies like equal amortization and linear amortization, but also comparing different methods like statistical land use change and carbon opportunity cost, we hope to provide a more broader image of land use change emissions, and in that way also provide more understanding to the user. So some facts about the tool. So it's a web-based tool with an intuitive interface, and it's very flexible and comprehensive. So we really put our effort into to create a more refined user experience than we ever had before in this Excel-based tool. As a user, you're able to select specific land management practices. So for example, tillage level or organic matter inputs, which influence your current soil organic carbon content. This is a tier 1 method from IPCC, but still it provides you some insight into how much carbon is actually lost from a conversion. So we offer these 3 basic functionalities, which is if the country and land use, previous land use is known, then you can calculate direct land use change emissions. If the previous land use is not known, but your sourcing country is known, we can use statistics to calculate statistical land use change. And if even the country is unknown, we can create a global weighted average of the statistical land use change to come up with a global land use change value for certain commodities, for all commodities actually. And this novel feature is carbon opportunity cost, so providing another type of insight into land carbon losses and land use change. Still, although we already are very proud of what we have accomplished with this web-based tool, we are also looking ahead into the future, and we foresee that the opportunities that we want to fulfill there. So on a really short term, we are still collaborating with WRI. So we are an aligned partner of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, Land Sector and Removals Guidance, and we'll be working in the next months and also after the protocol has been finished to incorporate any changes and alignments to those standards where possible. Some practical updates which we plan to implement in the next half year. So on also a quite short time frame, new FAO data is available, and some is still to become available, I think, which we will use to update our statistical land use change calculations. Also, we will work to incorporate land use change values for grassland and grazing, which are not fully covered at this moment in the tool, but we plan to do that on a short notice. Also, we plan to incorporate a correction factor for double cropping and fallow land. So basically a correction factor for land use efficiency in different lands, different countries. And we plan to include emissions from biomass burning. So other non-CO2 emissions that occur from these land use changes. A planned effort that doesn't have a fixed time frame yet is we want to improve these carbon opportunity cost calculations. We've been also briefly in contact with the author of this method. So we want to make it more location specific and more crop specific. Well, on the outlook, so more on the longer term, we're looking for integrations with geospatial data. So as we mentioned a couple of times, there's different data sources that can be used in land use change calculations. Statistics, which we use right now, have benefits but also have drawbacks. And with improving technologies and availability of geospatial data, yeah, we plan to integrate that also in our tools and products. So let's take a look at the tool itself. It might take some time to start up the calculations, but well, this is the interface that you'll see. I'll actually start by showing the calculations directly, and then I can show the other functions that the tool has. So as a first step, you select which basic methodology you want to implement or which you want to calculate with. So this can be on the most generic level if both your previous land use and your country is unknown. So this global weighted average, or we can do statistical land use change on a country level, which is the one that I'll look at now. And then later we can briefly look at how the direct land use change and the carbon opportunity cost function works. But let's stay at this functionality for now. So you can select different crops. You can select them or search them by typing, and you can shift select to create an overview of a lot of different crops. Same holds for countries and for years. So this is also a new functionality where you're not just able to select the most recent year, but you can look back into time to also, sort of, if you're doing a rebaseline, so if you're switching from one methodology to the other, you can look back into time to trace back what your emissions were in previous years. Here we can see some of the other input parameters, so amortization methods, amortization time, tillage level, organic input level, and some other functionalities. Then if we click on the results, we can expand them and look into underlying parameters. So for example, which kind of conversions took place, which are the emissions related to each of those conversions, what are the current carbon stocks that are calculated for soil and vegetation, but also, for example, what are the climate types and the soil types which are considered in this calculation. And the nice additional functionality is that you can switch to this other tab, which has time series, and here you can look into the underlying data. So you can select from this drop down what kind of parameter you want to take a look at. So area harvested from your selected crop or forest area, and you'll see it in this graph. So if we select multiple crops or multiple countries, then they'll also show up in the same graph. I think we're quite short on time, so I'll just show the carbon opportunity cost really quickly. Loading always takes a while the first time you open the tool because it was out for a while. As you can see, in the meantime, it was adding these other countries into the graph. And here we are at the carbon opportunity cost. So again, you can select certain crops and certain countries, but the rest of the parameters are a bit less elaborate. You can, for example, choose your amortization time. So let's set it to 30 years. Yeah, I was still in time series. And it will show a similar results pane. So the ability to expand, for example, the carbon stocks of the pristine land and the current land use, the climate types which were assumed to do these calculations. And in this case, we don't have a time series because the results are time independent. Just to note that there is a methodology description within the tool itself. So there are some main explanations here, but also you are able to download the full methodology document from the tool, in addition to glossary and additional background data and documents which are used. Yeah, I think those were the main functions to show. Maybe if there are specific questions, I can show other parts of the tool. But first of all, I want to just highlight how you can start using this land use change impact tool. So there's different types of licenses available, for example, a research license or a commercial license. And if you're interested into using this tool or obtaining a license, you can reach out to tools@blonksustainability.nl. And if you didn't see enough of the tool from this short demonstration, then yeah, we can plan a demo just for you. Also, beside this tool, we have different land use change impact products related to it. So we have a data set which contains statistical land use change values for 9,000 crop country combinations. And it can be obtained using both equal and linear amortization. And also we provide a training on land use change accounting. So visit our website for more information on that. So let's use the last few moments for some questions from the chat.
Yeah, there came in some additional questions. Lisanne, how much flexibility is there within the tool for users to adjust parameters?
Yeah, so I showed it really briefly, so maybe it was difficult to catch all of the functions. But basically, you can set the amortization method, amortization time, you can set different years, and of course, crops and countries. So in that sense, there's much more flexibility than there was before in the Excel-based tool, and also more flexibility than just selecting a standard that you want to comply to.
And now that it's an online tool, will there more frequent or faster updates?
Yeah, so that's a big benefit of shifting to a web-based tool, indeed. So we plan to update the background data yearly so that we have updated land use change values each year when new FAO statistics become available. And also if we implement certain methodological changes, like we plan to do in the next half year, so including grassland or including this crop rotation factor, for example, then we will, well, I can show it maybe quickly, will enable you to switch between different methods. So if you remember here, we currently implemented the option to select a certain methodology, and the data version is now hard-coded, it's not an option. But if we would create methodological changes, you would be able to switch between those methods so that you can still go back to calculations that you performed before with older methods, but also directly have access to these newer methods. So it will be much easier to provide everybody with an update of the tool through this web-based platform.
Okay. And then one last question for Jishin. Can the Look Impact tool be integrated into CIMA-Pro?
Currently, the Look Impact tool is not directly integrated into CIMA-Pro. So Blonk has another major database product called AgriFootprint, which was also mentioned by Lisanne before. It is a secondary database focusing on feed and food commodities. The impact results from Look Impact tool are fully integrated in AgriFootprint, and AgriFootprint is available as a library in CIMA-Pro. So it's not directly, but you would also see the results there.
Yeah, and maybe to add on to that, if you would create an inventory with specific calculation settings that are not selected in the background of this AgriFootprint database, then you do, of course, have the flexibility to go into your lifecycle inventory and adjust the emission. So make a manual adjustment, basically, of your land use change emissions. Are there any other?
There are more questions, but
we're out of time.
Yeah, exactly. but we will make sure that all questions will be answered.
Yeah. So thank you everybody for your attention, and we're looking forward to hearing more questions or interest from you later on.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.